By that time, the spring of 1943, only one of the pilots from that aerobatic team was still alive in the 586. Raisa Belyaeva had returned from Stalingrad and had 2 kills to her credit from that time. Gridnev says Belyaeva was an exceptional person. It seemed that her body was not even like other bodies. She could withstand very high Gs. During training flights, she could beat any man. I never met any man like her. She could withstand so many Gs that when you were flying against her, you would black out trying to keep up with her. But he says that Kazarinova and Osipinko were still waiting for an opportunity to get rid of Belyaeva, and that presented itself during the summer of 1943. There were several suspicious incidents. She was a test flyer for aircraft that had been repaired, and in July 1943, she was killed in a crash while test flying a fighter. Gridnev believes that it had been repaired with defective parts. So Gridnev believes that Khomyakova, Belyaeva, and Prokhorova were purposely assigned dangerous and unreasonable missions in order to hasten their death. He told me, I understood then, and so I understand now, that Kazarinova and Osipinko had a plan to destroy them. Well, this is a conspiracy theory. Could they really have been out to kill people like that? All I can tell you is that Gridnev's explanation fits the circumstances in a way that others don't, that many women told me privately they accept his explanation, but for perhaps obvious reasons, the Soviets would not allow this to be published. And in fact, Gridnev's memoirs, when he first wrote them, his own son burned them because he was afraid it was politically dangerous, and then he completely rewrote the memoirs, but never could have them published in the Soviet Union. So what Gridnev thinks is that Osipinko despised the idea of separate women's regiments. That was his motivation. And Kazarinova was simply incompetent and vengeful. And after she lost command, she was bent to have revenge against the women that she saw as having opposed her. Soviet women did fly in other regiments, in addition to the 3 that I've already mentioned. For example, this is Valentina Grizodubova. This was a friend of Raskova's. They'd flown together often. She commanded a partisan resupply unit, a transport unit during the war. Other women flew bombers. There were women in Sturmoviks. So there were scattered women in many other regiments, but not recorded routinely. It's very difficult to find the records on them because the Soviet Army simply didn't keep track of women as a separate category. Now, I want to talk about the little dotted line here about the group that went down to Stalingrad in September of 1942. One of the squadrons, Belyaeva's squadron, was sent from the 586 in the middle of September. This was the worst period of the fighting when the German offensive was at its height. And they were thrown into action with Air Force regiments that were poorly equipped, poorly supplied, demoralized by heavy casualties to that point in the war. And the squadron of 8 women pilots and their maintenance crews was then divided into 2 groups and sent to 2 different regiments to augment those pilots during the Battle of Stalingrad. Obviously, combat flying at that time was dangerous and very demanding, and the men didn't expect these women to do well at all. One new commander said, this is combat, not a flying club. There are air battles every day. We're waiting for real pilots, and they send us a bunch of girls. So the reception wasn't exactly pleasant. One group of 4 pilots was commanded by Belyaeva. She's on the right here, and it included Lilia Litviak and Katya Budanova. What's interesting is they were sent to a regiment that did not fly Yak fighters, so their aircraft couldn't be properly maintained. They didn't have the parts that they needed for them. And so again, Gridnev would explain that not as just an administrative error, but as part of an effort to endanger these women and get rid of them as quickly as possible. Lilia Litviak, though, quickly set the pace when she got to Stalingrad. On September 13th, 3 days after arriving there, she scored her first 2 victories. She shot down a bomber and an Me-109 fighter. Ina Pasportnikova, Litviak's mechanic, remembers that the Messerschmitt pilot bailed out and was captured. He was a winner of the Iron Cross, brought back for interrogation, and he asked to meet the pilot who had managed to shoot him down. And when they brought Litviak in, perhaps you can imagine his reaction. He thought this was some kind of ridiculous joke. And he refused to believe that this was the person who had shot him down until she gave him a blow-by-blow of what the engagement had been like. Well, for any pilot to achieve 2 kills in one flight on her 3rd day in combat is a pretty remarkable thing. It also made Litviak the first woman to shoot down an enemy aircraft in history. That fact has gone completely unrecognized. Chomikova, back at the 586th, shot down her bomber 10 days later and usually gets credit for being the first woman with a kill. But archival records make it quite clear that Litviak was first. Probably this went unnoticed because she was on temporary assignment to a regiment that had no stake in publicizing her achievement. The 586 didn't own her. She never went back to the 586, and in fact, some of them don't like her for the fact that she wouldn't come back to that regiment. And in less than 3 weeks, they were transferred again to yet another temporary assignment. 2 months later, someone back at Air Defense Headquarters seems to have noticed that, oh, these women probably should go back to their original regiment. But when that order came down, Litviak and Budanova and a couple of others appealed to stay at the front. They wanted to be with the active duty Air Force, where the real fighting was, and not go back to air defense. And so their commanders refused to send them back, and they stayed at the front. One of the pilots has said that Budanova and Litviak were both excellent flyers, but very different in every other way. Budanova was tall, she kept her hair cut short, she was a cheerful, lively character, he says, and in her flight suit she hardly stood out from the fellows. Beside Budanova, Litviak, who was only about 5 feet tall, seemed like a little girl. Litviak was thoughtful and quiet, and one pilot who knew her calls her a model of femininity and charm. She was pursued by several love-smitten pilots, as you can also probably imagine, but this same pilot says, she reacted extremely reservedly to the rapturous glances. She showed no preference to anyone, and this was especially impressive to us. Now, it seems that with Litviak, personal relationships took a back seat to the job at hand. It was wartime. She wanted to prove herself as a fighter pilot, and not just from ambition or patriotism, but she also wanted to redeem her family name. In 1937, her father had been arrested during the purges. He disappeared and was never seen again. Litviak never stopped believing in his innocence, and she seems to think that by achieving certain things in combat, she could somehow reclaim the family's honor. So she was very determined not to tarnish her own reputation and to become the best fighter pilot that she could. So this idea that she could redeem her father, who had been declared an enemy of the people, certainly was a special incentive, but it also was a source of a deep fear for Litviak and many other Soviet pilots, because more than anything else, she was afraid that she would go missing in action. Any Soviet soldier or pilot who disappeared was automatically suspected of desertion. Pilots, of course, often flew deep into enemy territory, or you might crash and your remains couldn't be identified. So she was determined that at any cost, if she was dying, that she would find a way to land in friendly territory so that she wouldn't add to the suspicion that her family was under. In January 1943, Litviak and Budanova were transferred once again to the 73rd Guards Fighter Regiment. There's a lot written about this unit because there were many famous fighter pilots, including the squadron commander Nikolai Baranov, I'm going to show you in a second, and Squadron Commander Alexei Solomatin. They had both already achieved numerous kills. Baranov, the commander of this unit, assigned Budanova to fly as his wingman, and Litviak was assigned to fly with Solomatin. Baranov seems to have had no problems at all accepting the women in his regiment. Ina Pasportnikova said, Nikolai Baranov was a completely extraordinary person in all regards. He was wonderful as a person, as a commander, and as a friend. And the pilots called him Batya, kind of like Pop or Dad. In his regiment, Litviak and Budanova got their chance to prove themselves in serious air combat. Litviak ended up with a total of 12 personal kills and 3 shared, while Budanova had 6 personal kills and 4 more shared kills. Litviak, though, was something of a rebel. She was definitely not a conformist, and she never tried to act like one of the guys. For example, she loved flowers. She had them painted on her aircraft, she kept pictures of flowers above her bed, and whenever possible, she put a little bouquet of fresh flowers inside the cockpit of her yak. Pasportnikova said when men flew Lily's plane, sometimes they found one of her little bouquets. They would pick it up between their fingers and shout, "What the hell is this?" And then they would throw it out of the cockpit. But in early February 1943, Litviak made her first 2 kills with the 73rd Regiment. Later that month, she was assigned to join a group of pilots called the Free Hunters. These were pilots in any regiment that were deemed skilled enough to go out on missions of their own, simply search and destroy, look for targets of opportunity. And she became a flight commander and was promoted from sergeant to junior lieutenant.